Now, I want to apologise first of all for those who have come to hear Tammer today. Tammer heard about a baptism happening in Orsonville, and so he asked if he could swap with me for the 14th of December. And I said, well, I have a baptism in Evans Head on the day, but I was able to swap my baptism into the morning, so I was at Evans Head this morning and I'm back with you today. So it's nice to be with you. And I just want to start by asking you a question. How many people would be happy with a parrot judging them? And what would that parrot say in your home? What would he hear most? Yes, very good. Very good. You know, I want to tell you a story about a time where I was on the wrong side of the law. I had gone through a school zone out at Tregeagle, and it was 1 minute to 4. And I cruised through there not thinking about the time because I didn't see anyone around. But there, right at the end, was this police car, and he pulled me over. And I said to him, "Who are you protecting? What's going on?" He said, "I was told to be here till 4 o'clock. I had missed it by 1 minute." So I decided to take my chances and front before the judge, because I thought this was a little bit unfair in my situation. I'd gone back past the sign and I realised that the tree had gone over the warning sign ahead, and so I got all my evidence together and I was going to put a case before the judge to try and get me off this fine. Well, the morning came and I'm sitting in the courtroom, and as it was happening at those times, the court cases before me were being heard. And as I'm sitting there, I'm listening to the judge and these people coming up before the judge, and they're putting their case before the judge, and the judge was just very, very harsh on every single one of them. And so I'm starting to get a little bit nervous. And it came to my case, and I stood up and I got my evidence all together, and he said something. He said, "You've been driving for a long time?" I said, "Yes." "I see that you haven't had a fine for the last 13 years. I said, "Yes, that's correct." And he said, "You're acquitted." I was a little bit disappointed because I had all this evidence that I wanted to put before him to get myself off the case. But he took me off the case. I thought, wow, how was that possible? I want to talk to you this morning about two courtrooms. Now, I'm not saying that there's physically two courtrooms, but what I'm going to say to you is there's two court sessions that we can face. We can face one by our own merits. That's you putting forward the evidence of how good you've been and see how you go. But the other is by giving your life over to somebody else and allow him to take your punishment for you so you can go free. What court would you choose? Would you decide, I'm going to do this on my own merits? Or am I going to do it some other way? I want to have a look. This is our second topic on judgment. The first one, we had a look at John chapter 9, and we looked at the story of judgment in John chapter 9. Today we're going to look at judgment in Daniel chapter 8. Now, interesting enough that Daniel chapter 8, often people want to put that separate and aside from the rest of the book of Daniel. And they want to put Daniel 8 and 9 completely separate because they were written 13 years apart. But if we did that, we would separate the whole of the Bible, because the whole of the Bible is actually written over a period of 1600 years by 40 different authors, and it ties so beautifully together. So I want to show us this morning that in looking at Daniel 8, we need to understand the whole of Daniel to understand what's going on in Daniel 8, and especially chapters 7 and chapters 9, the ones either side. Now, I'm not going to cover everything in these notes, and I should have actually broken this up into 2 studies, but I didn't get time to do that. So this is something that you're going to have to go through at home afterwards to get the full lot of it. But I want to focus more on this idea of 2 courtrooms. In chapter 7, we see this majestic courtroom scene, and in chapter 8, we see this cleansing of the sanctuary. And we're going to look at the difference between these 2 courtrooms and what that means for you and I living today. So let's take a look. Daniel, by the way, his name means God is my judge. And Daniel is actually, when we think about it, is a book of judgment. If we were to look at chapter 1, really I would suggest that Daniel chapter 1 is God's ways against man's ways. And there's a judgment process that happens at the end. And these people that have chosen God's ways, we find that they are 10 times better when it came to that judgment time. Daniel chapter 2, we see the kingdoms of this world being judged and being destroyed by this rock cut out without hands. In Daniel chapter 3, we see judgment upon people who refuse enforced worship. And they were cast into this fiery furnace. In chapter 4, we see a judgment on a king that actually enabled his own salvation. And that's really significant as well. But then we see judgment against Babylon and its king. It was weighed in the balance and it was found wanting. And that night, Babylon and its king were destroyed. In chapter 6, we see judgment against those enforcing God's people to worship. We see Daniel there was told that he wasn't allowed to worship anyone else but the king, and because of that he was thrown into the lion's den, but we find that judgment eventually came on those that plotted against Daniel, and they were thrown into the lion's den and destroyed. We find in Daniel 7 the judgment against the little horn. And this is a majestic scene. This is a scene where we find that the Almighty stands up. We find a fiery stream issuing before him. We find 10,000s upon 10,000 seated. We find the books open and the courtroom scene ready. And we find judgment on the little horn. When we get to Daniel chapter 8, we find something that some of us don't associate with judgment. And that is the cleansing of the sanctuary. The cleansing of the sanctuary. But we're going to see today the cleansing of the sanctuary preceded with a 10-day period of judgment beforehand. And that judgment was, do I want to make myself right with God? Do I want to allow him to pay the price for my sin? And that judgment was a recreation. In chapter 9 we see judgment on who? On Jesus. We see Jesus taking our punishment for us. In chapters 10 through to 12 we find the effects or the results of the final judgment. So we see, when we look at the whole of the book, it's about judgment. It's about judgment. Well, we're going to find 2 types of judgment. So I want you to open your books, open your Bibles with me to Daniel chapter 8. And I want to look at the 2 verses. Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. By the way, tell me, how many people fear judgment? By earthly people or by someone else? It's interesting, a few more hands went up when we said earthly people. I want to show you today that there is no need to fear when we know the person who is judging. Let's read Daniel 8, verses 1 and 2. It says there, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time." Here we find in Daniel that Daniel 8 is being tied to Daniel 7 because it came after that first vision that he saw. He says, "I saw in vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw the vision that I was by the river Ulai." Here we have, it begins in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. What's interesting is, and what helps to help us that we know that these things are tied together, is that Daniel 7 starts with in the 1st year of Belshazzar. Daniel 8 starts in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 9 starts with the 1st year of Darius. Daniel 10 starts with the 3rd year of Cyrus, who was part of that Medo-Persian kingdom as well. 1st and the 3rd year, 1st and the 3rd year. And it helps us to tie these two chapters together. We find that the vision takes place by the river. And if we look back at the vision that he saw earlier, it was by the sea. These beasts were coming up out of the sea. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these beasts that come out in Daniel chapter 8, because that's not my focus today. But clearly in your notes you can see that the ram is actually told in Daniel that it is Medo-Persia. The goat that we see coming after us is told that it's the kingdom of Greece. And it's very interesting because in Daniel chapter 2, all you get is that the head of gold was the kingdom of Babylon. And then you've got to trace history down through the ages to know what come after each of those kingdoms. When we get to Daniel chapter 7, we're not told what those animals represented, but the characteristics of those animals clearly portray these same kingdoms. But here, we're actually specifically told what these two animals are. And I think the reason for this is to help us to see that it is tied to Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and now we're using those same kingdoms, but we're using different animals to describe them. In Daniel chapter 7, we had a bear that was raised up on one side, and also after it, a leopard with 4 heads. But here we only see 2 animals, a ram and a goat. And the divided kingdom of Greece is described as 4 horns coming up out of that goat when the other power was broken off. And like I say, there's more in my notes about this. But I want to focus on the next power. The next power we find appears in verse 9. And it says there, "And one of them come out a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and cast some of the host of the stars to the ground, and trampled upon them. He even exalted himself as high as the Prince of Hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifice and cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered." So who is this little horn? I don't know if you remember our study on Daniel 9, but our study on Daniel 9, we have the same little horn doing very similar things here as what it did back there. It attacks the daily sacrifices. What are the daily sacrifices? Well, those daily sacrifices, that fire that burnt in the sanctuary, represented God's faithful presence among his people. So it was attacking God's presence among his people. It was trying to take over from that presence. In seizing the daily sacrifices, the horn substitutes itself for God in the religious experience. Now it casts truth to the ground. It was interesting when I looked up this Hebrew word for truth. Because this Hebrew word for truth is synonymous with law. And in Hebrew, this word for truth is a concrete action of obedience to God. So not only is he attacking God's presence, he's actually attacking God's law. And when we looked at Daniel 7, we discovered that the little horn there was wanting to do what to God's law? It had intentions to change the times and God's law. The times in God's law was Jewish sacred festival days. And the most Jewish sacred festival day is what? The Sabbath. And it's interesting that the Sabbath actually acknowledges that God is our creator. So by changing the Sabbath from the seventh day to the first day, you're actually taking away from God, who is our creator. He also attacks the Prince of Hosts, which is a technical term for the high priest. Is later described as Michael. Another thing that we don't realise that happens, because we've got English versions of the Bible, but the Bible was originally written in Hebrew. But it's interesting that in Daniel, we have a certain section of Daniel that was first written in Aramaic. So the first chapter of Daniel, we have Hebrew. Chapters 2 to chapter 7, we have Aramaic. And then in chapter 8, we have a change from Aramaic back to Hebrew, and it finishes with Hebrew. Now, what does this tell us? It basically tells us that the initial first audience was to Hebrew people. It was to Hebrew people. So they would get this language that is spoken here. The focus is not so much on the kingdoms. We have a change from beasts to clean animals. And we notice something different. So we don't mention the first kingdom, which we knew was Babylon. We don't mention the next one, which we know was Rome. But we just mention these two kingdoms in between. And it's interesting when we look at the Bible that the first kingdom under Cyrus was considered a type of Messiah. Why? Because he was the one that made the decree that Israel could go back and build their temple, could go back and restore true worship to God. And so Cyrus was a type of deliverer. The next kingdom that we have here is Alexander the Great. And it was amazing when Alexander the Great went and conquered all those places, he left Israel alone. But he conquered the other nations around it who were suppressing God's people. So in a way, he was also a type of deliverer. So we have two animals. So the sanctuary language and the sanctuary animals all points to God's just judgment through the cleansing of the sanctuary. And we're going to have a look at that as well. But beforehand, I want to show you this picture that happens that links both Daniel 7 and 8 together. We find in Daniel 7 the vision with the animals coming up out of the sea. In Daniel 8 we find the vision by the river. Then we have beasts representing kingdoms in chapter 7. We also have beasts, although they're clean animals, representing kingdoms in chapter 8. We have the little horn appeared with the little horn appearing in Daniel 8. But what we have which has changed is in Daniel 7, after the little horn, we have this judgment scene. And after this judgment scene, we have one like the Son of Man. It's interesting looking at Daniel 7, you said, like a lion, like a bear, like a leopard, like a terrible, horrible, fierce-looking beast. And then we're introduced to one like the Son of Man. He's not a beast. He's completely different. And when you get to chapter 8, we see this same pattern happening in chapter 8. But rather than judgment, we see the cleansing of the sanctuary. And straight after the cleansing of the sanctuary, we have the appearance of a man. We're going to find that appearance of the man is actually Jesus. And what we're going to find really significant about the appearance of the man, it is actually also the vision of the man. The vision of the man. So when we look at Daniel 8, verses 13 to 14, we have a change from then I heard. So he was seeing before, now he's hearing. And when that happened in Daniel chapter 4, we find judgment came into place. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one, a certain one, speaking. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices, the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? The question is this: how long are God's ways in the sanctuary going to be downtrodden? How long is this going to happen? And the answer is what? 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Then the sanctuary will be cleansed. It's interesting when we look at a version of the Bible which is called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, one of the first translations of the Bible. And in this Greek translation, this word for cleansing of the sanctuary is a word that basically says to purify, which is the technical term for the Day of Atonement. What about the Day of Atonement? What did the Israelites experience at the Day of Atonement? They experienced that this was a final judgment before the return of Christ. This was a final judgment that made them, everybody in the whole camp, right with God. Everybody was now in harmony with God. And anyone that wasn't prepared to make themselves right with God at this time were actually cast out of the sanctuary, because this was a time when the whole of the sanctuary and the people around it were completely cleansed of sin. And they knew, the Jews knew, that this pointed to the final judgment period of time. So it says, how long? How long are God's ways going to be put down? And the answer is unto 2,300 evenings and mornings. Some versions will say days. The correct version is evenings and mornings. And I love this term of evenings and mornings, because evenings and mornings, where else do we see evenings and mornings? In creation. So what it's saying is, this cleansing of the sanctuary has something to do with creation. This cleansing of the sanctuary, we're going to see, is actually a recreation of us. The term evenings and mornings, the cleansing of the sanctuary, ties it to creation. And it's interesting when you read through the book of Leviticus, the two Jewish festival days that are tied together through the book of Leviticus is both Sabbath and the cleansing of the sanctuary, or the Day of Atonement. Why? Because in these two places, the Sabbath was a day that no work was to be done. In the other Jewish festivals, it says no regular work was to be done. So it ties creation with, or the Sabbath with, the Day of Atonement. And in Hebrews, when you get to that Greek word that basically says there remains a Sabbath rest for God's people, that word is a sabbatismos. And in the Greek, the Septuagint, that version is tied to both creation and the Day of Atonement. So Sabbath is a part of that. Part of a recreation. The Sabbath reminds us of two main things: that God is our creator and Jesus is our recreator. He recreates us anew. And so these two things are tied intricately. The three angels' messages also tie judgment to the Sabbath. In verse 7 it says, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heaven, the earth, and the sea, and the springs of living water. Tying Sabbath to judgment. That worship him who made comes straight out of the fourth commandment in Exodus 20 and verse 11. Even the prayers that were recited on Kippur remind us that the believers, that the God who judges is also the creator that forgives. When I was over in Jerusalem a little over a year ago, one thing that I didn't realise that blew me away was we were there on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And what was really interesting is that the dress changed. Normally the Jews had this dark black wear that they used to wear, but on Yom Kippur it was white or white and black, representing that was a cleansing, a new creation. So it says, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. How can we work out what this is? Because a number of people say that this is literal days. Some people say because it's evenings and mornings that it's actually half days. And some people say, well, you know, there's a precedent set in the Bible that a day equals a year. If you go back to Ezra and Nehemiah, you can find these places. But I think we should be able to find it in Daniel. And we can. Because when we look at the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, we find that while Daniel there is considering the 70 years that he's in captivity in Babylon, the angel of the Lord came to him there and said, 77s are determined for your people. Now some versions will say 70 weeks, but the correct terminology is 77s. 70 lots of 7 days. And that was significant also because 7 sevens also remind us of the year of Jubilee, which led up to the year of Jubilee, where everything was given back to the rightful owners. But here he's given a prophecy of 77. 77 equals 490 days. And this prophecy has a start date, and it also has a time where it comes to an end. And that ended with Jesus coming to this earth and doing his ministry on this earth and dying for you and for me. That prophecy can only correctly be interpreted if you allow a day for a year. Also, when we get to another prophecy in Daniel about 260 days, we find also, just like the 2,300 day prophecy represented a time in the end, that prophecy also represents a time in the end. And that prophecy also reveals and can only come about if you add a day equaling a year. And it reveals the Dark Ages, those Middle Ages. And so here Daniel already sets a precedent that we know a day equals a year. So if we have this prophecy, this 2,300 day prophecy, and where it says in the bottom of verse 17, the vision refers to the time of the end. And if we come down to verse 26, it says the vision of the evenings and mornings, which is true, but seal up the vision. So we find that Daniel, if he's using this mindset of a day equals a year in other places in Daniel, it must also match for the 2,300 day prophecy. Truth was going to be brought down. The Sabbath was the major truth that was brought down. Because why? Because it takes away from the fact that God is our creator. It takes away from the fact that Jesus is our Redeemer. And it puts themselves in the place. One other thing I want to show you that happens. And that's if we come over to Daniel chapter 9. And it helps us to tie Daniel 8 and 9 together. To know that these two chapters go together, even though they were written 13 years apart. In Daniel chapter 9 and verse 23 it says, at the beginning of your supplications the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. Now this is really interesting, and I hope you get this. because this is getting to the main point that I want to make this morning. When we see the angel Gabriel, we only see the angel Gabriel come in these two places to talk about this vision. The only other time we see the angel Gabriel was when he came to announce the birth of Jesus. So we know that these two are linked because we have the angel Gabriel coming for the 2,300-day vision, but we also find that he also announces the coming of Jesus. But something significant happens and we don't pick up in our English language. And I'm sorry I'm using a lot of Hebrew and Greek this morning, but it helps us to understand. But when it says there, in chapter 9 and verse 23, consider the matter and understand the vision, that word for vision is a different word to what is used in the whole of the vision for Daniel chapter 8. There's two Hebrew words for vision. One is hazon, and the other, this one here that's specifically talking about here, is mara. And when we look at this word, we find that this word here, when the angel Gabriel come to give him more understanding of the vision, it was specifically the vision of the 2,300 days. That's how we can know that Daniel 9 is tied specifically to Daniel chapter 8. So here, when he's coming to give him understanding of the vision, it's understanding on truth being downtrodden for 2,300 days before a solution is going to come forth. But the amazing thing is that this word for vision, Mara, this 2,300-day prophecy vision, the cleansing of the sanctuary, is a Mara vision. What does Mara mean? Mara means that it is something that is seen, that is phenomenal, that is spectacular, which is it's an appearance that happens which is absolutely stunning and beautiful. So a different word is used for this vision because there's something significant about this cleansing of the sanctuary. The cleansing of the sanctuary here is beautiful and stunning. This is a type of judgment. Why is this judgment so beautiful and stunning? Why is it phenomenal? Well, what I discovered only a week ago was that this same word Mara is the word that is described, that also describes the man. In our Bibles it says the appearance of the man, but this word is actually the vision of the man. This beautiful, spectacular vision of the man. And the beautiful thing is that this word, tying this word to the 2,300 days and to the man, says that the vision is actually about the man. The vision is about Jesus. So that tells us what? The man involved in the judgment process is the same Son of Man that came to this earth and gave his life for you and for me. Is that beautiful? No wonder they use a different word for vision, Mara, which is beautiful, stunning vision, because this is something that's beautiful, because it is a different type of judgment. The cleansing of the sanctuary involves the man, and that makes him the best judge ever. We started by asking ourselves, how would we like a parrot bringing judgment on us? And most of us wouldn't really like that. How do we like judgment when it happens on this earth? Well, we don't really like that either. But we can love this kind of judgment because this judgment depends on our judgment of him. Going back to our model, we have the succession of what happens in Daniel 7 and Daniel chapter 8. The little horn and then judgment. The little horn and then the cleansing of the sanctuary. Then one like the Son of Man stands up. And also the Mara man. The beautiful man that is involved in judgment. Daniel 7 reveals a judgment process where we rely on our own merits. When we stand before the judge, when the books are opened and every one of our deeds is brought forth. But Daniel chapter 8 changes from Aramaic back into Hebrew to reveal a judgment that is associated with the cleansing of the sanctuary. This is a different type of process. This process of judgment is first determined by your judgment of Jesus. Do you judge him as worthy to follow? Do you judge him as worthy of your worship? Are you attracted enough to him to give your life to him? There are two types of judgment here. One will render you eternally lost, but the other will render you eternally saved. When we look at the time of this judgment, scholars clearly agree that the 2,300 days started with a time period of judgment in 1844, which means for you and for me, we are now living in the final judgment time. A time where we need to determine whether we are going to make ourselves right with God. A time when we're going to choose, do I want this judgment where I stand here without a saviour on my own merits? And I'm a pretty good guy, aren't I? What's my chances of getting through, do you think? 60, 70%? Who agrees? 80%? 0%. Some people up the back put their hand through. I must realise how evil I am. So there's this kind of judgment, or there's the judgment which involves the cleansing of the sanctuary, which is all about the Mara man who gave his life for you. And in the judgment time, all he's asking is that you seek forgiveness and make yourself right with him and give your life over into his so you can be void in the judgment. No wonder this vision is called a Mara vision, a spectacular, beautiful vision, because it involves Jesus, the one who desperately wants to take you to be with him eternally. So it's up to us. What courtroom will you decide is going to determine your eternity? Thank you. Let's pray. Let's stand. Dear Father in heaven, I just want to thank you for Jesus. I want to thank you that you're going to make everything right, and you're in the process of doing that now. May we determine to make you our judge, our advocate, and may we give our lives completely over into yours, so that we can be with you for eternity. Be with each one as they go their separate ways today. Keep them close to you is my prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.